Hello Internet people. Today I'm going to be talking about my wife's custom-built extra small Juliana Strega. If you're a long-time viewer of this channel, then you probably know that Cory's super petite at 4'11". So this presents some challenges when it comes to picking a frame and speccing it to find a good balance of comfort, fit, stability, and maneuverability. This video is going to be a little bit more in-depth than your typical bike check, because I'm also going to be going through the rationale behind some of the decisions that we had to make to get that right balance. So if you're a petite rider or you're building a bike for a petite rider, then some of the information in this video might interest you. Because this video is going to be a little bit more in-depth than a typical bike check, it might actually bore some of you, so I apologize ahead of time. So anywho, let's get right to it. So again, this is an extra small Juliana Strega, otherwise known as a Nomad V4 circa 2018 to 2020. They recently updated the Nomad. We now have the V5, but it only goes down to small. We currently have it running in the low setting with a reach of 386. So a 386 reach would be the same as me with a 455 reach, which is basically what modern bikes are at right now. Somewhere between 450 to almost 470 on some mediums these days. So even though it's a slightly older model, we really don't need a newer bike with even longer geometry. It just wouldn't work with Cory at 4'11". A couple of other benefits of running it in the slacker setting. Of course, with a 64.6 degree head angle, it's going to be a heck of a lot safer on steep trails. Even though it slackens out the seat tube a little bit, this is actually beneficial for small riders. So if you were a tall rider with a slack seat tube, you'd be right over the rear axle. So your weight would be so far back that when you would get to climbing, it would be terrible. Your front wheel would keep rising and it wouldn't be a comfortable experience. But if you're a shorter rider, and if you have a steep seat tube, like on most modern bikes, with such short travel, the saddle wouldn't be able to get out of your way enough for you to maneuver the bike. But as a shorter rider, if you have a slack seat angle, the saddle goes down and forward, and so it gives you a little bit of room to maneuver, especially when you can only ride a 100 mm dropper post. So now we can go ahead and go through the spec of the bike. If you're a regular viewer of the channel, you might notice that some of the parts are a little bit familiar because a lot of the parts actually came off Cory's Spectral, like the wheels, for example. She's running the DT Swiss M1700s with a DT Swiss 350 hub with a 54 tooth ratchet upgrade because realistically she doesn't need heavier duty rims. She's super light. She's 120 pounds soaking wet, so we don't need the E1700s or super duper downhill enduro rims. And it's a big plus because it makes the bike a heck of a lot lighter than it was stock. Another thing that came off of Cory's Spectral is the SDG Allure. As you can see, it still has the repairs that I did to it, and that's holding up pretty well. And of course, we can't forget the Magura MT5 brakes with HC3 levers. I know they say that the HC3 levers aren't supposed to work on the MT5s, they're only supposed to work on the higher end MT7s or the higher end 2-piston Magura brakes, but they actually do fit on pretty much all of the Magura master cylinders. So if you've been thinking of doing that, you can go ahead and give it a try because it works and they're great. This time around, Cory's only running a 180 rotor on the front instead of a 203 like last time, so it's 180 front and rear. So this time I'm also running the one-piece pads that usually come stock with Magura MT5s. They're a heck of a lot less bitey and less powerful than the single-piece pads. And on the rear we're running the separate pads, but they're the green sport pads. So they're also less bitey than the performance and race pads. This should make it so Cory doesn't go OTB randomly from slamming her front brake so hard. Hopefully. Since these are the same wheels that Cory had on her Spectral, the tires that were on those wheels came with it. I just recently replaced them before we sold her Spectral and bought the Strega. So we have a DHF on the front and an Aggressor on the rear. They're both the triple compound versions of these tires, and although they're only in the XO casing, Cory's super light. Since she's not pressing as much weight against the rocks as a heavier rider would, it's not as likely that she's going to tear through the tires. And of course there's the benefit that it makes the bike lighter, because nobody wants a bike that's half of their weight, right? We also went ahead and transferred the water bottle cage from our Canyon Spectral because this is such a tiny frame you're not going to be able to fit a normal cage. The shock on the rear is the stock shock that comes with the bike. It's a 2018 version of the RockShox Super Deluxe R. R meaning it only has a rebound setting, so you don't have any compression levers or lockouts or anything of the sort. Not that Cory ever uses that stuff. So that does simplify the setup process, since all I have to worry about is setting the spring rate and the rebound. If it had all the knobs, bells and whistles on there, it would be next to impossible to set it up for her, because she wouldn't be able to describe exactly what's wrong with the feeling of the suspension in case she feels that it isn't optimal. Usually her description is, it doesn't feel right. And if I'm to ask why, that's usually about as far as it goes. It just doesn't feel right, and I have to figure it out by just kind of observing how the bike handles as she's riding. So that makes it extra tricky, so it's best to simplify the setup as much as possible. So that takes out ever putting a Fox X2 or anything completely out of the question at any point in time. When it comes to the front suspension, we also transferred over the Lyric from her Spectral. But the Lyric on her Spectral only had 150 mm of travel. So if you noticed, for a 2021 Lyric, the stanchion numbers are on the wrong side. And that's because I kept the uppers from the original fork that was on this bike and just transferred over the lowers and all of the internals of the 2021 Lyric Ultimate. So it has all the performance of the 2021 Lyric Ultimate, except that the crown isn't glossy and the markings are on the other side. Why did I do this? Because I wanted the sag markings to be correct, basically to coincide with the travel of the bike. This is a 170 front and rear, and it would just be really weird if this had 150, 160, and then I would have to take a tape measure out every time I measured the sag or whatever. Not that I would actually have to do that very often, but you know, it looks neater when it actually has the right sag markings on there. Also, I could have just transferred the damper and the air spring and kept the black lowers that came with the bike, but the red lowers just look cooler. And it also kind of matches the Christmassy vibe of the bike overall. Since we're going for red and green, these are still the same grips that were on her Spectral also, with the little yeah boy on there. A little worn out, but still good. And this time, Cory's running some beautiful red Dady T-Mac pedals. Even though Cory's tiny, she prefers a larger platform, especially when you're going downhill on some rough terrain. You want all the grip you can get. When it comes to the drivetrain, we're still sticking with SRAM GX Eagle, except this time we have the newer GX derailleur that you can use with a 52-tooth cassette. But this is still the cassette from Cory's Spectral, because I also just recently replaced that, so naturally I transferred it over to this bike. And again, just like on our previous bike, a 30-tooth oval chainring from Absolute Black. Now you might be wondering, what are those? So these are 140 mm cranks. This is gonna raise some eyebrows, but let me explain. If it wasn't for these short cranks, I don't think that this bike would fit Cory very well and she wouldn't be able to maneuver it. That's as low as you can slam this saddle before that tire hits the back of the saddle on even a medium drop. And if Cory were to run normal size cranks, 170, 175, she would only be able to have a saddle that drops about 80 millimeters. Any more of a drop and it would just go too low. And since it can't go low enough if she had long cranks, then the saddle would still be pretty much way too high for her to be able to maneuver the bike. So since we can't lower the saddle, why not raise the rider up, right? So now we can actually have a 100 mm drop saddle, and with her feet closer together when she has the pedals in a flat position, her body's also a little higher when the saddle is down, so she can actually lean the bike left and right. So to give you a little context, imagine if you're a medium-sized rider, let's say 5'9", 5'10", and you're riding 200 mm cranks, and the top tube is also too high for you, so you won't be able to lean the bike over. But if your cranks are a little shorter, you're a little higher, what ends up happening is the top tube is a little further away from your butt, basically, and therefore it isn't just stuck between your legs and you can't tilt it left or right to maneuver the bike. The other benefit is she can pedal smaller circles. So again, imagine you had 200 mm cranks. How comfortable would that be? Nobody wants to be pedaling like this. You don't have a lot of power if you're trying to push the pedal like that. But if it's right below you, then you can put your weight into it, right? So a smaller circumference circle is going to be more comfortable for Cory to pedal. It's going to allow her to maneuver the bike better, and it's going to allow her to run a longer dropper post. And just overall, it's going to be a better fit and it's going to be more comfortable for her. Now that I've done this and she's actually been running these shorter cranks on her hardtail as well, and she's been running them on those, I'm starting to realize why she hated climbing so much. Imagine being on a long grind on a gravel road and you're just making these giant circles with your legs. No wonder it just seemed like it was so exhausting for her, and I'm over here just casually pedaling. So anyway, now let's finish off with the dropper post and a couple of other things on the cockpit. Of course, SRAM Eagle GX shifter. And the dropper post is a 1UP V2. This is the 120 model that I just reduced down to 100 mm. And like we've been doing on all our bikes, we've paired it with the Wolf Tooth light action remote. Why this remote as opposed to the other popular ones? Well, it's simply because it's just a little bit longer, so that gives you a little bit of a better leverage. So the more leverage you have, the easier it is to press, because of course Cory's tiny and you don't want a difficult to press lever. You want her to be able to put as little effort into that lever and get that dropper post moving, right? So now let's get to the bar width. We are running 740 mm bars for her. Naturally, you don't want your bars too wide, because if you have your hands all the way to your sides with super wide bars, you can't lean the bike and you can't turn the bars more than just a few degrees. 740 might seem a little narrow to you, but keep in mind that your average enduro rider at around 5'10", 5'11"-ish is actually running 760. We would go even narrower, but if we did, we'd be sacrificing too much stability. There is a way that I could actually cut these handlebars narrower while maintaining stability, and that would be by getting a shorter offset crown for this fork. The shorter offset typically increases stability, and on top of that, it also decreases the wheelbase, so you're still able to make very tight turns at slow speed. So I think in the future that might be beneficial for Cory. Might be able to trim these down to 730 or 720, and that way it'll give her a little bit more maneuverability than she has. So even with all of that, in some respects, the bike is still slightly too big for her, which makes all of the things that she's able to do even the more impressive. Well, Cory's doing the big one. Woo! At the end of the day, I'm pretty happy with the result here. I don't think we could have gotten any of a better fit from any other model of bike out there. This travel and with this geometry. All the other bikes that fit her are kind of old-fashioned trail bikes with like 67-degree head angles. And that's just not what Cory's looking for. She's been next to begging me to get something super slack and super modern for a while so that she can feel more comfortable on the steeps. So yep, I think that's everything. I'm gonna go ahead and apologize again for this super duper long-winded and over-explained video, but I'm sure there's someone out there that can find this information beneficial, even though it basically bordered on rambling. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.